This event wouldn't have been possible, meaning the speaker series, without a lot of help from the higher-ups around here, Chancellor Simaswamy and Vice Chancellor John Kennedy especially, Julie Hayes, who's Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts, Commonwealth College Dean Dan Gordon, and then also the Department of History, Architecture, Latin American Studies, Public Policy, Middle Eastern Studies, and also I want to single out the Interdisciplinary Studies Institute, which is directed by Stephen Klingman, which has done quite a bit in the short amount of time to really foster dialogue across a number of disciplines and perspectives on campus. So this is a titled The Lessons of Guantanamo, and of course there are plenty of them, and it's kind of diverse. And because we knew that we would be having some middle and high school teachers here, we wanted to focus on kind of a variety of things and not just one thing. So while you certainly hear about Guantanamo in the context of what's been happening in the last 12 years since the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror, in fact, Guantanamo as a base goes back, well, Guantanamo as a place goes back way, way back to the Indians and then the Spanish, but as a U.S. naval base, goes back to 1898 and the Spanish-American War. And so I thought it was appropriate to start with an image of the naval base shortly after it was established. And actually, one of our speakers, the first one, Fredalene Dowd, is going to talk a little bit about this picture in the context of how she ended up at Guantanamo and actually grew up on the base. Mrs. Dowd now lives in Worcester and actually has been a resident of Massachusetts really since the mid-1960s. And part of the story of her being back in Massachusetts really is tied in with the events that were happening in Guantanamo in the early 1960s, which she's going to talk about. The second speaker, James Yee, Captain James Yee from the U.S. Army, retired, was the Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo in the early years of the century, 2000, I can't remember the dates, 2002, 3, whatever. He'll fill that in. And was suspected of actually collaborating with terrorists, and himself wound up, as he'll tell the story, incarcerated for 76 days in the brig in South Carolina. And then came out honorable discharge, and for the last years or so has been really speaking about Guantanamo. He's written a book about his experiences, and I think you'll find his story really compelling. And then our final speaker is Buz Eisenberg, who is a lawyer who is based in this area, Western Mass, teaches as an adjunct at Greenfield Community College, and has taken on quite a few of the cases of the detainees at Guantanamo. And he'll be speaking about that, as well as probably what's going on there really up to the minute, and the other so-called black sites that Americans have around the world where they keep people imprisoned. So without really spending any more time with introductions, I think we'll have Fredalene come up, and I will sit here and help to move the slides forward. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Fredalene Bernardy Dowd, but you can call me Freddie. First off, I'm honored to be here to speak about my 7 years on Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. For me, it's my home. That's where I grew up. So, in 1957, my dad got a job with the government, and we went over to the base. This old picture, Camp Grenadillo, has meaning for me because when we got there in 1957, we were moved to Grenadillo Point, which was made into housing. And when I saw this picture, I said, oh, David had to have it. This is Grenadilla Point to me, but it was like years and years ago, and I was laughing because it's changed. I can't imagine. When we got there, it was concrete housing, playgrounds. You go down the cliff, well, we had a fence. Go down the cliff, and there was a small harbor, and then you were in Castro's land. So it was pretty good living there. We had lights, we had everything. They shipped in milk and everything and food, but we had everything that was needed.
I'm going to go to the next slide.
Yes, go.
Since you mentioned food.
Food. That was, when you were a dependent, you had to get a mess card so that you could shop at the commissary down in the naval station downtown. And so we had to have one of those. And if we didn't have it, you didn't shop. So
Just go to the next one.
this, we did have Girl Scouts there. Believe it or not, we did. And we would camp over. We had main base, and then across the harbor, the main harbor, we would have Leeward Point, and that's where we would camp out for Girl Scouts.
You ready for the next
Yes. Oh, God. All right, we're not going to talk about the other two. This has relevance, according to David. I saw the picture Dr. No, the first one with Sean Connery and Ursula Andress, and as 13 years old, you know how girls are at 13, I wanted to come home and be just like her, sexy and beautiful. David automatically connected the Cold War with the movie and this picture. This is why this picture is here, because it was during the Cold War. And that's why it's there. That is my front yard. Sometimes it was green, but that is the front yard. My dad made that front yard better looking than it was. So, yeah, that was Dr. No. Okay. On the base, we had everything. We had swimming, beaches, swimming pools, sports, athletic fields, everything. This beach was known as Windmill Beach. It was open to the public, dependents and military. This was taken right after Hurricane Flora hit us. It hit us bad. I'm sorry. We lost some Cuban friends, and that's why it's... Afterwards, when we were allowed there, this is damage. It took, we would have concrete cubanas that were open, or we would have a place to cook and change. Concrete, naturally. Everything was blown down. So we decided, my sister's on the little right hand of her head, and we decided that we were going to go to the beach anyways, whether it was messed up or not. And this is the damage that storms can do in the Caribbean. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
All righty. When we got there, this is the Northeast Gate. If the Cubans wanted to come on, they had to pass through the gate. Before the revolution, this is how we got out to go into Cuba, which we did quite a lot. We would go to Caminero, we would go to the beaches, Havana, everywhere we wanted to. Once the revolution started, no more. We could not go past the gate. The Cubans had to go through the gate and be searched before they could get on. Before they left the gate, they were searched. And they were not allowed to take anything with them from the base. But there was a lot of us, my parents included, that would show them how to hide items on their bodies. And that's how they would get some stuff out. But this is how it was in '62. That's a U.S. Marine. His name was Steve. He was my friend. That is how they guarded the fence. Very simple fence. But that is actually what they did. That's how it was. We didn't have barbed wire. We didn't have... At the time, it was very simple.
Now, we have a picture of the fence a little later that's not
Yeah.
simple.
not some hold up. This is what they did. Okay. This was an award. We had a lot
Talking to
of
the microphone.
we had a lot of sports there, and we did mostly sports because it took up most of our time. And we had an athletic association ward dinner, and it was supposed to be held October 22nd, 1962, and awards were to be given out. But an hour into our school day, October 22nd, the principal came on and said, you are to go to your buses, you are to go straight home. No one is to go anyplace else but straight home. You will have an hour to pack as much as you can into one suitcase apiece. You will wait outside your homes, and a bus will be by to pick you up. And that's all we were told. And they made sure that we got the buses to go straight to our homes. When we got home, my mother was in a dither. She had packed her suitcases. She left it up to us to pack ours. I didn't take any clothes with me. I took my letters and everything. I was 12, what can I say? But we had the hour, and that was it. And we waited outside, and we got picked up by a bus driven by a military man. And he would not answer any questions. He drove us straight to the docks. And there were all the dependents, all the civilian dependents, close to 4,000. And we were told to line up, given name tags, told us where we were going to be loaded onto ships or go by planes. And that is how we were evacuated from Cuba. We did not know that there was a missile crisis going on. We did not know anything. We were just told, you're leaving. And so my family and I were boarded on the USS Upshur, a troop transport carrier. This is the letter from the commander, captain of the ship, commander, and this is what he handed out to us 2 days afterwards. I could not believe all the sailors gave up all their bunks to let us use them. And they were 6 bunks up, you know how, up and down? Is that how you say it? Yeah. And that is how we sailed to Norfolk, Virginia. They were so, it was amazing how kind they were to us. And we still did not know what was going on until we got the letter. Do you have that letter?
I do.
Until we got the letter from John F. Kennedy, the president. And we still don't know that it was going to be a nuclear war or not. But this is a copy. I have the actual letter at home that kind of said he was sorry that he had to do this, basically. And anyways, we landed in Norfolk, Virginia, and there was so many people there to help us, and we still didn't know what was going on, really. I mean, so anyways, we came back for Christmas.
Okay.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro kept, how can I put this nice?
You don't have to put it like that.
Okay, he kept,
It's a college campus.
he
You
kept
can say what you
bitching at our Admiral, Buckley, about the water and how he was gonna dizzle with it and everything. And one day Admiral Buckley stood up and said, enough is enough is enough, that's it. So he went out there and he just put up a sign that says, you don't have to bother with us anymore, we don't need your water. And this is the actual photos of the pipe being cut on our side. And he just said no more, he'd had it. So we went on rationing, water rationing, and everyone had to learn 3-minute showers. We had to collect the water from the showers, and we used that to water the grounds. We collected rainwater, dishwater, wash machine, everything was collected and used for something else, and that is how we survived until the water started shipping in from Haiti and other areas. Even then, it was tight with water until they started building the very first desalinization plant, which takes in salt water and makes it fresh. On that base today is that very first desalinization plant. And they're going to leave it there. They're not going to take it down. I must say, life was different there. It was slow. It was very, very slow.
Put this slide up
Yeah.
about the-
That's our answer to Cuba. that's what we said. But I have to say, we had just as much fun on the base as everyone did in the States. We had DJ, we had parties, we didn't lack for anything, but it was a slower pace. One stoplight, it was just, all I know is that we have to keep that base. We have to keep it going, and it's my home. Thank you.
Great job.
Oh, thank you, darling.
James, you can come up. We'll get your presentation up. You can advance it however you want, just use the arrows.
All right, good. All right, can everyone hear okay? All right, I'll just start by saying that my name is James Yee, and I'm the former U.S. Army Muslim chaplain who served in Guantanamo Bay back in 2002 and 2003. I'm going to talk a lot about my experience there when I was assigned to the joint detention operation and a little bit that happened afterwards. But let me start by looking at, real quickly, Guantanamo by the numbers. Today there's still 164 prisoners being held in Guantanamo by the U.S. military. At its peak, there were over 700. And when I was there in 2002 and 2003, there were about 680. Okay? Of the 164 that are still there today, the Pentagon says that 46 of them are too dangerous to release, but they cannot be put on trial because of a lack of evidence. And the current administration says that they'll be indefinitely held there, and they call it, quote, continued detention, or what I'd refer to as indefinite detention. Initially, the Obama administration had planned to try or put on trial 36 of them, but that number is now down to 20, especially after two recent cases that did go to trial for conspiracy and material support of terrorism, where a U.S. appeals court indicated that these crimes were not triable as war crimes because they're not internationally recognized offenses, war crimes offenses. Of the 164 prisoners that are still there, 84 have been cleared for release, but yet they remain in Guantanamo. And of those 84, 56 of those prisoners are from Yemen. And President Obama had put a stop of releasing any prisoners from Yemen after a fellow came from Yemen and tried to take down a plane that was coming to the U.S. The Christmas bomber on Christmas Day a couple of years ago was coming from Yemen, or had been in Yemen, and as a result, Obama said no more prisoners from Yemen will be released from Guantanamo. And I believe that moratorium has been lifted, but still, we're seeing little movement of any prisoners being released from Guantanamo, with the exception of 2 Algerians that were released last month. A little bit about the costs, what it costs U.S. taxpayers for this military prison operation. Representative Adam Smith from Washington State, who was my representative when I was living in Washington State, when I was stationed at Fort Lewis, has recently said that it costs $2.7 million a year to house one prisoner at Guantanamo Bay.
Why?
This costs the U.S. taxpayers $1.2 million per day to keep this operation going. Overall, our government has spent $4.7 billion since 2002 to have this operation in place, to fund these facilities, the military tribunals that are going on, to feed the service members, all of what goes on in Guantanamo for this joint detention military operation. Extremely, extremely expensive. In 2002, I received orders when I was at Fort Lewis to go down and be the chaplain at Guantanamo Bay, predominantly because of my faith. I'm a convert Muslim who left the U.S. military in active duty in 1993 after having served in the first Gulf War as a Patriot missiles fire control officer. I converted to Islam during that time. I deepened my studies. After I left active duty, I ended up in Syria, studied traditional Islam, and then came back on active duty in January of 2001 as a chaplain, and became one of our nation's first Muslim chaplains to serve the ranks of our U.S. military. So I got those orders after 9/11, but prior to that, I was at Fort Lewis when 9/11 occurred. And when that happened, there was an enormous amount of backlash even on the military base at Fort Lewis, where I was a battalion chaplain of the 29th Signal Battalion. Within our unit, we had several Muslim personnel who were serving the military, and there were other soldiers who were criticizing them for being Muslim, asking them how could they serve in the U.S. military after Muslims attacked the World Trade Center, etc. So my battalion commander had me give a presentation to some 700 soldiers of our battalion on Islam and Muslim culture, and to be available to answer any questions that any of these troops had about Islam. And I answered those questions. And we had set aside 2 hours for this block of training, but we could have gone on 3 hours, 4 hours, because the soldiers wanted to know about this faith, about this religion called Islam after 9/11. And as a result of that, my battalion commander then offered my expertise in the religion of Islam to the other units that were at Fort Lewis. And as we began sending troops to Afghanistan, all of the other units that had been prepared to deploy would contact me and give some type of training, some sensitivity training on religion and faith in that part of the world. I received some recognition during that time. And then I became a point person for the U.S. military on public affairs, anything dealing with Muslims who's serving in the military. There were media journalists who wanted to cover the story. What was it like for a U.S. military person, a Muslim, serving in the U.S. Army after 9/11? And those interview requests were directed to me at Fort Lewis. So I received this recognition during that time. And I believe that recognition is what led the U.S. military, the Pentagon, to say, hey, this is the guy we want down in Guantanamo Bay when the prison camp opened. And so I was singly deployed from my unit at Fort Lewis down to Guantanamo. And at first I didn't know what to expect when I got down to Guantanamo in November of 2002. I did know that there was an enormous amount of misunderstanding about Islam that was happening at the base just from media reports that I had read in the newspapers. Things like the troops, the initial prisoners that were at Guantanamo, when they were making their prayers, they took their towels and they fashioned them into turbans so they can pray when their head was covered. And the troops would come into the cage-like cells at Camp X-Ray, and they would take their rifles and they would knock these turbans off the heads of the prisoners while they were praying. I saw a comment from a female soldier saying, you know, in their countries, these people, they tell the women what to do, but now they're here in Guantanamo and I'm a female U.S. service member and I'm telling them what to do. Right? So there was some insensitivity going on in Guantanamo, so I knew I can play a role in helping to educate our troops our service members about Islam and hopefully help get this operation running more efficiently and smoothly. But I wasn't prepared for the abuse that was going on in Guantanamo when I got down there. From day one, when I stepped into the cell blocks of Camp Delta, pictures of which I will show, it was quite clear that the conditions in Guantanamo were more fit maybe for animals rather than human beings. And I described these facilities as cage-like cells, because that's where they were like, cage-like cells made of steel mesh. In Camp X-Ray, before I got there, they were made of chain-link fences. There was other abuse going on in Guantanamo that was quite open. And much of that had to do with religious persecution. And that stemmed from desecrating the Holy Quran by interrogators and guards in order to incite the prisoners, or in hopes that interrogators could gain some information from these prisoners who were being held in Guantanamo, especially because they were being characterized by the Bush administration as the worst of the worst, dangerous men who were captured in the war on terror. They must have some information. There was sexual humiliation by interrogators in Guantanamo, especially female interrogators who felt very competitive with their male interrogator counterparts, but because they were female felt that maybe they had an advantage interrogating Muslim male prisoners who came from very conservative societies where they didn't have much interaction with women outside their own family. So there were instances where female interrogators would even grab the genitals of Muslim male prisoners in the course of interrogating them. There was other abuse, like what a prisoner described for me of what was in an interrogation room. An interrogation room which had marked on the ground a large circle. And in that circle there was a satanic symbol, a pentagram-like star in the center of that circle, and this prisoner would indicate that the interrogator would take that person, put him in the center of that satanic circle, and attempt to force him to bow down and pray and prostrate, like in the form of the Muslim prayer, where Muslims bow down and prostrate their head to the ground in honor of one God. But this interrogator attempted to force prisoners to prostrate in the center of this satanic circle while screaming at this prisoner that Satan is your God now, not Allah, meaning Allah, the God, the Almighty, the creator of the heavens and earth. So this was religious persecution. And this was done because military intelligence, interrogators at Guantanamo understood that the core belief of Muslims is to believe in one God. And they tried to break that belief of these prisoners in order to facilitate maybe getting some information from them. So our nation, which was founded on this idea of religious freedom, when the Pilgrims came and landed on Plymouth Rock in search of a place where they can practice religion freely, we find that in Guantanamo Bay we have the opposite. People being persecuted for their religion because these military intelligence personnel think that it can help them in their operation. President Bush had said Geneva Conventions don't apply down in Guantanamo. This is a different type of conflict. Other administration officials would say the gloves are off, opening the door to allowing essentially the military to do what they wanted to do without being held accountable. So as a result, the International Red Cross has said that the treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay has been, quote, tantamount to torture. Amnesty International, the human rights organization, has called Guantanamo Bay the, quote, gulag of our time. Editorials in newspapers across the country have said that Guantanamo Bay is a legal black hole. My role in Guantanamo as a chaplain was to inform my chain of command of what was going on inside these cell blocks, and to extent inside these interrogation rooms when I found out from prisoners and other military personnel, like translators, what was going on inside these interrogation rooms. And I brought that to the chain of command. And my input, I believe, was really valued by my supervisor, who gained a greater understanding of why prisoners in these cell blocks would protest and demonstrate and cause riots against the guards, banging on their steel doors, banging on their steel beds, after prisoners came back from the interrogation rooms with bruises and broken teeth. After serving 10 months in Guantanamo, I got R&R, rest and relaxation. That meant I get to go home, back to Seattle, Washington, on a 2-week leave, knowing that after 2 weeks I got to be back in Guantanamo to finish what would be a full year of duty at Guantanamo. So I got on a plane from Guantanamo, landed at Jacksonville Naval Air Station. I had a connecting flight after I would catch a taxi to the international airport in Jacksonville and get that flight back to Seattle, Washington, and then see my family where I was residing in Olympia. But I never made that connecting flight back to Washington State from Jacksonville. Why? Because when I landed at the Jacksonville Naval Air Station, I was swarmed by customs officials, by immigration officers, by the FBI, by Army counterintelligence, by NCIS, and I was interrogated and held and essentially arrested in secret. My family had no idea what had happened to me. I was whisked away, held initially in a week in the Jacksonville Naval Air Station prison, and then I was carted away to the Consolidated Naval Brig down in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, the Consolidated Naval Brig in Charleston, South Carolina is the place where the Bush administration set up a prison for those he termed U.S. citizen enemy combatants. The foreign enemy combatants, we know, are held in Guantanamo Bay and in other secret CIA black sites. But if you happen to be declared an enemy combatant and you were a U.S. citizen, you got sent to the Consolidated Naval Brig in Charleston, South Carolina. Names like Jose Padilla, Yasser Alhamdi were being housed there. And that's where I was sent, even though the U.S. military said that me being sent to this prison was only a coincidence. But I know it wasn't a coincidence, because when they carted me there, they threw me in the back of this armed guard truck. 2 other armed guards in the front. I was shackled at the wrists, at the waist, the ankles, in a suit of chains, just like the way they shackle prisoners at Guantanamo. I had these black and out goggles put over my eyes so I couldn't see. I had these devices put over my ears so I couldn't hear. I was subjected to what's termed sensory deprivation, something done to instill fear and intimidation. But it was something I was familiar with because I saw that's how they treated the prisoners at Guantanamo, these suspected terrorists. So I knew automatically, immediately, that I was suspected of being a terrorist. I feared for my life, had no idea where they were taking me. Thought they were taking me to some black site here in the United States, maybe never to be seen again. I was put in this prison cell and finally learned that I was in Charleston, South Carolina. But my family had no idea where I was. It was like I had disappeared in America. A U.S. citizen, born in this country, a 3rd-generation Chinese American, a graduate of West Point. My younger brother, a graduate of West Point. My other younger brother serving as an Army doctor. My father, also a U.S. citizen born, served in World War II as a draftee. But yet somehow I'm being accused of spying, espionage, aiding the terrorist enemy, threatened with the death penalty by these military prosecutors. My family learned of where I was when they saw me on the news. After about 2.5 weeks, information leaked to the media, disclosed, was the headline of the day, that the military chaplain at Guantanamo Bay had been arrested and was suspected of being this terrorist spy down in Guantanamo for the prisoners. I was held in that prison for 76 days in solitary confinement. During that time, no doubt, my life was investigated from top to bottom. But after 76 days, I was released from prison. All of those accusations that they made against me, that I was a spy, that I was a terrorist, that I was a Chinese Taliban, were dropped. I was reinstated, sent back to Fort Lewis. And then I tendered my resignation from the U.S. military. And in January 2005, received an honorable discharge. And upon separation, I received a second U.S. Army Commendation Medal for, quote, exceptionally meritorious service. Once I got out of the military, I got right to work, and then I documented my experience in a book entitled For God and Country, Faith and Patriotism Under Fire. And since 2006, or October 2005, when that book hit the shelves, I've been traveling across the country, even to some countries overseas, in the UK, in India, and other places, Germany, to talk about my experience at Guantanamo Bay. I championed a senator named Barack Obama when he ran for president, because he had the strongest stance saying he would close Guantanamo Bay. And I became a delegate for Obama in the 2008 election campaign, and supported him as a national delegate at the Democratic National Convention. And was thrilled when he was elected, and then signed on his second day of office an executive order to close Guantanamo Bay within 1 year. That would be January of 2009, when the prison would be closed. I was thrilled, because who else to clean up this mess in Guantanamo but a constitutional law expert and former editor of the Harvard Law Journal to do this. But 2009 passed, 2010, 2011, 2012. Here we are in 2013, and Guantanamo is still open, and Guantanamo is still a mess. So I continue to speak about my experience in hopes that one day this prison facility will be closed. I conclude my short talk also by recognizing Ms. Freddie, who gave our first presentation. I've been lecturing about Guantanamo for the past few years, since 2005. But Freddie, your voice is missing. It's amazing that the documents you showed are still available to show what life was like in Guantanamo prior to the mess that it is today. So I encourage you to keep telling your story about Guantanamo, because that's a voice that's not heard in the circles of those who are talking about Guantanamo. To close, I just want to show you a few slides of what the facility looked like in the early stages of Guantanamo Bay. This picture here is the front gates of Camp Delta when I was down there. Right? And notice the motto of Guantanamo for the troops: honor bound to defend freedom. This is how prisoners were transported to Guantanamo in the initial stages, on the back of these large military cargo planes, hooded and strapped. What disturbed me most about this picture is not only how the prisoner was being treated, but what hangs over their head. This picture tells the world that this is a U.S. military operation. Again, another form of the sensory deprivation as prisoners being transported to Guantanamo. The famous picture of Camp X-Ray, which the military released, the Pentagon released to the world to attempt to persuade in those early days that we were indeed treating prisoners humanely. But when they released this picture, of course, the headlines, and especially the European country, was torture. Camp X-Ray, you can see the chain link fence type cells that prisoners were held in. A closer look at the sensory deprivation. I had those goggles, those ear devices put on me. They didn't put the mask on my mouth, though. It was said in Guantanamo, though, that the mask was needed for these prisoners because they were so dangerous that they might chew through the hydraulic lines of the planes to bring it down. This hopefully would be a preventive measure. Camp X-Ray. That's what Camp X-Ray looked like after it was emptied out and prisoners moved to Camp Delta. Again, this looks like an animal stall, something that you would house dogs or cattle, not human beings. And then when I got there, Camp Delta was up and running. Camp Delta had cell blocks like this, About 27 of them, each of them could house up to 48 cells, 24 on one side, 24 on the other, corridor down the middle. Each of those doors is a single cage-like cell. That's the cell. Of course, a picture taken after the floor is mopped and shined, and the military will explain to the people who come to Guantanamo to see it, said, look, we're very culturally accommodating. We give the prisoners a toilet that they're familiar with, a water fountain in their cells so they can wash before prayer. We tell them which way is Mecca so they can pray in the right direction. And to pass time, they can play checkers, make the food taste a little better with a couple extra packets of salt. Items referred to in Guantanamo Bay as comfort items. Sounds like these prisoners are staying in the Comfort Inn or something. But really, that's what they get. This cell with the flimsy plastic mattress, and if they cooperate with the interrogators, maybe they get some of these niceties, these comfort items. Later on, the cells were renovated and looked similar to this. But that's what it looks like for prisoners every day when they were in Camp Delta looking through this steel mesh. Everything would be blurred. Detainees would be escorted around, and we were directed to refer to them as detainees. They weren't prisoners because that might suggest prisoner of war. And we know that prisoners of war have rights under Geneva Convention. But Geneva Convention, as I mentioned earlier, didn't apply in Guantanamo. We call them here detainees. Later, a medium security facility was opened where prisoners could actually live in groups of 10 in some type of communal facility. And that was the only place where prisoners could actually pray together. And they were taken out of those orange jumpsuits and put in these nice white uniforms as an incentive to give information to their interrogators. Camp Iguana was housing the 12 to 14-year-old prisoners held in Guantanamo. There were 12-year-old prisoners at Guantanamo. They were held separately in this little facility called Camp Iguana. This was a juvenile detainee. He was 16 or so when he got to Guantanamo. He was held actually in the main prison facility. A guy named Omar Qadr, Canadian citizen, has since been released, convicted of supposedly throwing a hand grenade that killed an American soldier. That was him when he got captured. And that hole in the shoulder is not where U.S. military entered into his body. That's where it came out, which tells you, shot in the back. Camp Echo was then built, and that was for some high-value detainees where they could be interrogated in their own cell, never having to leave their cell, never seeing sunlight. The interrogator could come and interrogate in that adjacent room. And then Camp 5 and 6 were later built long after I was gone from Guantanamo, and you can see how permanent of structure they are. Concrete floors, steel, metal, metallic locking doors. Camp 5. That's what it looks like inside Camp 5 cell. And then Camp 6 was built, two-tier. Camp 6 can hold up to 200 prisoners. Camp 5 about 100. This is an indication to me that Guantanamo is very permanent. And now there's a Camp 7, which houses the high value, the 15 or so alleged conspirators of 9/11 and other terrorist attacks. So that's Guantanamo, what it looked like when I was there, and some of the facilities that are currently in operation today. So I close by saying I welcome the comments of our next speaker and look forward to hearing more about some of the legal aspects of Guantanamo Bay. Thank you very much.
Can we turn this off, or do you want to leave this on? Somebody want to turn this? And since in November, next month, I'll be celebrating my 9th year, November of 2004.
I'm just going to turn off.
If you could just slide that.
Turn the light.
I think it's the next one. It's blinding me.
Yeah.
Sensory deprivation at work here.
better?
It's a little better.
It should be off.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. In November of 2004, I'm an attorney from here in Western Massachusetts. I've been a trial lawyer for about 3.5 decades now, and I volunteered to take on a Guantanamo detainee through the Center for Constitutional Rights, based purely on the fact that I was affronted by some of the media which reported what James just depicted in those slides that was going on at the time. I felt that as an officer of the court, as someone who had taken an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States, it was extremely difficult for me to do nothing as I watched. I had previously done some habeas corpus work, and for those who don't know, that is a civil constitutional challenge to people's detention. The Tower of London defense, the great writ of habeas corpus from the Magna Carta in 1215, which says that when James's family didn't know where he was, he had a right to go before an independent judicial officer and claim that his detention was unlawful. Clearly it was. He was deprived of that right for 76 days, 79 days. Had he been afforded the right to habeas corpus, then the jailer would have been, am I hearing angelic things? The jailer would have been forced to bring his body, habeas corpus, before the court and show cause why it was appropriate to detain him. And failing to do that, then he would have been free to walk out into the streets of London under the Magna Carta. That's habeas corpus. We've used it. I used it in death penalty cases. People have used it in criminal cases for a long time. It's a civil constitutional challenge, and having experience with it, I felt like it would be an affront to the oath that I took if I didn't volunteer to help some of these people. So I did, and within a very short time, I was given the case of Abdul Salam Gaithan Morif Ashahiri from Saudi Arabia, who was 16 years old at the time he was taken into custody. I represented him until June of 2016, when the military started to ship out the first of the 116 Saudis of the 129 that were then detained back to Saudi Arabia in an agreement that they had with the Saudi government. The way that we did this work is after, am I getting some feedback here? How's that? Is that better? Anybody can't hear me? That what we did is we filed a petition once we had the name, because in the very beginning we didn't have the names or the ISNs, the numbers that these humans were tagged with of these individuals. And so what happened is some very courageous people started traipsing through Afghanistan and other countries and advertising that they'd be at a certain place for a certain period of time, and if you are missing a loved one, a male, and you have reason to suspect that he's in Guantanamo Bay or in U.S. custody, that please come here, sign an affidavit, the last time you saw him, and who he is, and what his name is, and his date of birth, etc., and we'll try to get a lawyer to represent him. That's how I got Abdul Salam's case. Through the Reprieve International from London, the London-based organization that got an affidavit signed by his cousin, his next friend. So we filed a petition in U.S. District Court in the District of Columbia, which is the only place that has jurisdiction over these cases, because our, like all legal cases, it was Abdul Salam versus George W. Bush. It's on the other side. So the place that has jurisdiction is the District of Columbia's U.S. District Court. We filed suit. Then in order to get down to Guantanamo, unlike Freddie, unlike James, the rest of us had to get security clearance in order to do this work. So we went through a process of the FBI investigating us and us signing waivers that they could look at our bank records and medical records, and if we had them, psychiatric records, and our debt. And after you fill out all the appropriate forms and they do an investigation and go and talk to 12 of your neighbors, knock, knock, knock. Hello, I'm with the FBI and I'm investigating Stuart Eisenberg, who lives down the road. with no explanation. I achieved that security clearance, and in March of 2005, took my first trip to that place which Freddie fondly remembers, and that place which I have nothing but, the only warm memories I have are the interactions with my clients and my colleagues at night when we could share our dreadful stories. I've been down there, I don't know, I've lost count, but almost a couple dozen times, usually from 3 days to 6 days at a time over these 9 years, visiting one of the 7 people that I've represented, or more of the 7 people I've represented, some of whom you may have met. Most of my clients, I think that the one who arrived the latest arrived there in June of 2002, so he has been there for 11 years plus. Most of the others arrived between January 11th, when they first started bringing people, and the end of February of 2002. After we would file early on, we started bringing all kinds of zealously crafted and as creative as we could be motions, demanding that the U.S. government answer us in court. And what we found was that the 19 judges who formed the U.S. District Court in the District of Columbia had a body of jurisprudence of which I was unaware. In their face, as much as some of them were sympathetic towards us, they found that there was a barrier. And the barrier is, I could bore you for maybe 30 or 40 hours. But the jurisprudence basically reads like this: during times of war, the President of the United States, in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief, has extraordinary powers. He can intern 110,000 Japanese because they're of Japanese descent during a time of war, because the Japanese had invaded Pearl Harbor. He can do all kinds of things, except the constraints pursuant to the Geneva Conventions, the 4 Geneva Conventions, and the Common Article 3 that we all remember says you can't ask them anything but their name, rank, and serial number. Sounds a little bit different than the description James gave of what they were being asked and how they were being asked questions. It says that they have a right to challenge whether or not they are being properly detained as having been on the battlefield. In other words, you're here to hear these 3 speakers today, and if the bombs start to drop right now out there, and you're running to get away from the bombs, and you're detained because you're on the battlefield, and you're interrogated, you have a right to say, wait a minute, I was here to hear a lecture, I wasn't here to fight. That's what Geneva Convention gives you the right to do, Common Article 3. They were afforded no such right. They were interrogated despite Geneva, and the reason why is because what James just said, which is Geneva Convention says that applies to combatants. But the President of the United States dubbed these men enemy combatants, so it doesn't apply. So I said, you mean if he called them schmutznik, that because a word is different than combatants, that Geneva wouldn't apply? And the answer in court was yes. This is a different kind of war. People aren't wearing uniforms. There are civilians. It's terror. We can't identify readily who our enemies are. And plus, it was argued, the U.S. courts have no jurisdiction over these men. U.S. courts' jurisdiction constitutionally is only pursuant to U.S. territory. Guam is U.S. territory. Puerto Rico is U.S. territory. District of Columbia is U.S. territory. Amherst, Massachusetts is too. Guantanamo is Cuba. It's owned by the Cuban. So therefore, we're only there under a leasehold. We're not the sovereigns there. And so in 2000, just before I started, the United States Supreme Court said in a 5-4 narrow decision, always makes me gasp that it could even be one person, let alone 4, there was an acknowledgement that the sovereign on that 45 square mile base that we just heard described by Freddie is the United States, and therefore, effectively we have jurisdiction, our courts have jurisdiction, we can bring habeas corpus. Well, that was the ruling. I've been a trial lawyer for a long time. I've done criminal cases, littering. My first trial before a jury, littering on the Montague Plains. I've also done multiple murder cases. I've seen a whole panoply of different types of cases litigated, but I never felt so impotent in my life as I did in those early days when we were trying to litigate these cases, because the courts, there was this overwhelming desire to acquiesce to the power of the commander-in-chief while he was fighting 2 and later 3 wars after we invaded Iraq. In the tradition of those cases called Eisentrager and Inrei Korin and the Korimatsu case, which challenged the Japanese internment, and the government relied on that incredible power that would grant to the commander-in-chief during a time of war. If you capture German Nazi soldiers in the battlefield and they say, I want to go to the US courts and challenge my detention, like Captain Yi should be able to challenge his, the US court said, not in the battlefield. You don't have that right because the battlefield is different. And so even though these men were captured in all sorts of places, 44 nationalities, and their bodies collected, even though the way that they came into US custody, 86% of them came into US custody on a bounty. That is, we didn't know how to find the bad guys. We knew that in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we knew that there were training camps, and we knew that Al-Qaeda was active, and we knew that the Taliban were at least acquiescing, if not actively supporting, those people that were responsible for 9/11. So we figured if we could just find foreigners in Afghanistan, then we'd be okay. So we started pamphleting. We dropped pamphlets in every village, and it said something like this. It said, we know, it didn't say this, we know that according to the CIA World Factbook, Afghanistan is the 3rd poorest country on the globe at the time per capita, probably still is. So they were offering the equivalent of over 300,000 US. You could take care of your families and your livestock. You could build schools and clinics for your children and your children's children if you just turn in any foreigner that you know. And so people turned them in, and they usually turned them into warlords, the Northern Alliance and those people that you've read about. And those people turned them over to the US and its allies. And the honorable young soldiers who were there in their fatigues, who knew nothing about Afghanistan, despite being trained a little bit about the virtue of Islam or the nature of Islam, they would take these men and they would say, okay, these are the guys who are being turned over, and immediately they'd be brought to Bagram and other US places, bases, and they'd be treated as the guys that we were looking for. And eventually sent in those cargo planes that were just depicted on the screen to Guantanamo. The interrogations were unrelenting. The interrogations were not just 24/7, but 24/7 all year round, by interrogators who started from the assumption that this is one of those hair of the dog animals responsible for the nightmare that was September 11th. And as a result, the thought was, we get the key to the big prizes, the big Al-Qaeda and Taliban brainstormers who came up with September 11th, who are in fact our enemies. It was a notion that was soon, so we had national security clearance. So there is a secure facility that we get to go to, and we get to see volumes of the evidence by court order, again, that's being used to hold our guys. And what I quickly learned is what I had previously heard. The entire Guantanamo scheme is a product of this notion that they call the Mosaic theory of human intelligence gathering. And that is, if I find out, I like this metaphor, so excuse me, if I could ask you where you parked and what the cars to the right and left of your car looked like, and which parking lot it is, and if I did that with enough people, eventually, without ever having seen it, I would get a picture of all the parking lots in this area. The Mosaic would be built to the point where I could make some identifying intelligence gains, which would help in our investigation of who are the bad guys and how do we find them and what do we do about them. Do I sound as fuzzy to you as I sound to me?
Yeah.
That's good enough.
Is this for amplification or is it for that?
It comes out of speakers.
Okay, so, no, I mean, it might be recorded. If I don't use this, is it going to interfere with, yes, you want me to use it? I'll just stay further away. Okay. So that was a theory. And we quickly came to several hundred lawyers. I was really there were the lawyers who challenged the question of whether Cuba is a site that grants jurisdiction to the U.S. That was resolved. There was a second wave of a couple dozen lawyers between the date of that case, which I think was June 28th of 2004, and October, who took on some prominent people from England, sort of people that look like us. And those people got lawyers quickly, and those people got out quickly, like Mosaic and others. Mosaic is, if you haven't read his book, you should read his book about his experience in Guantanamo. And by the way, he described that airplane ride. He said he really understood what the slaves must have felt like when they were kidnapped in Africa and brought by ship in cargo holds that were dark to the United States. That imagery always struck me as a pretty accurate portrayal of what he must have felt and the others must have felt. So what happened was to make what could be, as I said, a 30-hour story short, we started to slowly erode the barriers to judicial review in some courts, where some judges thought that our clients deserved a hearing. Because what else are courts for if not for a hearing? The opportunity to address the lawfulness of their detention. As I said, I wish I could take credit for it. Having nothing to do with me, having to do with an arrangement between our closest ally in the region, the Saudis, and the United States, in waves of about 16, the Saudis, 116 Saudis, who the U.S. came to understand, not the guys we were looking for. And we've wrung them for everything we can get, and we're not getting a lot of intelligence out of them. Were sent back to Saudi Arabia. They were put through a 30-day program about the right way to interpret the Quran, the right way to understand what jihad is, to make sure that they got cleansed of any problematic tendencies they may have. And then the Saudi government very generously made sure that each of them had got money and jobs, and my young child, one of the 12.5 children at Guantanamo, by the way, I think Omar Carter was 14 when he was taken into custody. And he's still in custody. He's just been taken out of isolation in Canada. But he got back, and his father arranged for a marriage. Arranged a marriage for him, yeah. So he's got a wife, and he's got a child, and he's working in his father's electronics plant, and he's doing quite well. And so, being a glutton for punishment, I took on another guy. I took on an Algerian. We call Terrari because that's the tribal region that he originally is from. And like a lot of North Africans, like a lot of Mexicans come to the United States, a lot of North Africans go to Europe. Find a better life. Sometimes they're illegal immigrants. Same kind of story happens. And being in the wrong place at the wrong time, he too got captured. And eventually got him sent back, and I'm not sure to this day why, except there was a recognition that he was nobody. He wasn't the guy they were looking for. So we took on another guy, Farid Said bin Mohammed. Really, I love all my guys, but I really love Farid, because he was a character and he was creative. And did you know Farid Said bin Mohammed, Algerian?
By name, no, but it's likely I met him.
Had a skin problem. I could tell you Fari's stories, and maybe I will afterwards if you want to. I'll assail you with Fari's stories. But Fari's case we finally got before the U.S. District Court. It was the first case that we actually tried through a major effort, and a judge who said, give these guys a trial. I want to determine whether or not they're lawfully detained, and enough is enough. And she very courageously stood up to the government's constant request for stays, which means just prolong it, just don't do it, and procedural barriers, and she said, enough, you'll be here a certain date and a certain time in September of 2009, and we had to close the courtroom because we had all kinds of information, which has since become public, that the only evidence that they had against Fari Saeed bin Mohammed was that along with 41 other detainees, he had been picked out his photograph was picked out by Binyam Mohammed, the Ethiopian British resident, who was tortured by having his penis sliced up with a razor blade and his chest sliced with a razor blade, and threats that his family would receive the same treatment, and written threat that we managed to find by an interrogator that his mother was going to have her chest if he didn't identify the people that he was complicit with. And so he did. This guy, and one of the 42 was Fari Saeed bin Mohammed, and they were holding Fari Saeed bin Mohammed based on that evidence. And after months and weeks of papers and hearings, and finally the trial, Gladys Kessler, a very thoughtful and very good listener, judge who believes in justice, wrote an 82-page memorandum opinion in which she said, torture procured evidence is patently unreliable. There's no way that you could trust that, given what he went through, that what he was saying was accurate. And she ordered that the government release our guy, and it still took months to do so. But Fari Saeed bin Mohammed is finally transferred back to Algeria on January 6th of 11. He was, except for Omar Khadr and a couple of Uyghurs, that's another story, the Uyghurs, who were similarly cleared by a court case. The government admitted in that case it had nothing on them and they were a mistake. But Omar Khadr was transferred back to Canada, a sort of collegial little deal between the US and Canada because we're kind of buddies. And these Uyghurs were transferred out. Nobody else was transferred for 2.5 years until on July 26th, my two other Algerians were transferred back to Algeria. Motai Saib and Nabil were transferred back just a couple months ago. The two Algerians that you mentioned were my clients. The seventh guy that I represented, the Palestinian, Taha Matan, still remains in Guantanamo, and I expect him to be transferred. He, when I first got involved, when Captain Yi was there, the courts said that there has to be some kind of a hearing process to determine whether these guys were in fact listening to a lecture or on the battlefield. The U.S. had already conceded that, I forget the percentage now, but a huge percentage were not on the battlefield. I think 8% of the men that they captured had been on the battlefield at the time of capture. The other 92% were brought in on a bounty, somebody fingered them, that was their story. And so the military created the Combatant Status Review Tribunals. You must remember them. The CSRTs, which my colleague Sabin Willett said, I would call it a kangaroo court, except that does a tremendous disservice to kangaroos. The Combatant Status Review Tribunal, you had no right to know the evidence against you. It was not a hearing, it was a meeting. They finally changed it from hearing to meeting. You were entitled to a personal representative who was not a chaplain. It was somebody whose job it was to explain exactly what this tribunal was doing as they were asking you questions. They were military personnel who just asked you questions. And if you asked a question like, I don't know if I ever met that person, where would I have met them? The question is answered this way. You don't ask questions, we do. Did you ever know this person? And that's how it went. It was crazy. And finally, in a U.S. Supreme Court case, in a portion of a U.S. Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court said you have to do better than that. And as a result of that, we came up with the Annual Review Tribunal, the ARBs. And in this annual review board, we lawyers were actually able to participate in coming up with, not by being present, by coming up with a memorandum or a letter or documents that demonstrated that our guy is not who you think or is, whatever the evidence is. So we were able to present some mitigating evidence, some defense of some kind in paper only. And a lot of the detainees at that point were so fed up that they refused to participate in the ARBs, but some in fact did. Matan, our remaining client there now, did participate, and in January of 2007, as a result of an administrative review board, he was cleared for transfer out of Guantanamo. In June of 2007, he was cleared again by the Bush administration as opposed to just by the ARB. And in January of 2010, he was cleared by the Guantanamo Bay Task Force, which President Obama had set up in Executive Order 2 when he was first inaugurated on January 20th, 2009. He was, after a year of reviewing all these cases, they cleared a ton of men. The total number of men who went through the gates of Guantanamo were 779, I believe. What the captain said is true. There's 164 left there now, and of those, 84 have been cleared, 30 of which are Yemenis, conditionally cleared. And the other 54 have been cleared for transfer. But because of the congressional act, much of what we're seeing today that has stopped the government yesterday, which is the procedural use of the rules in the House and Senate to authorize a national budget for the military. First in 2011 and then in 2012, there was an amendment to that which said no transfers from Guantanamo unless, and it had this little caveat that said the president could take it on as a political liability, do it at his own risk, and certify men for transfer. Coupled with that congressional ban and the president's lack of courage, those men sat there until Motai and Nabil were finally the first two to be certified for transfer just in the last couple of months. The story of Guantanamo is a story of anything but honor bound for freedom. It's a story that stains our sense of what freedom is, what our sense of due process is. It says that there are some people who are not entitled to any review. We can capture them, we don't have to make an allegation against them. We can't even tell them what they're alleged to have done. And we're not going to, nah. And at the same time, some people throw up their arms in political victory signs and say, look at what we've done in the name of our national security and safety, while people who are being detained are people like heroes, like Captain James Yee, who never have a chance to say, what did I do? Never had a chance to say, I didn't do it, but it's impossible to do that if you don't even know why you're being detained. These men to this day, the vast majority of the 164, the vast majority of the 779 who have gone through there have never been told what they're alleged to have done. And here's the worst part. I am governed by a protective order, and if I violate it, not only do I lose my security clearance, I could be prosecuted. Right? Like Edward Snowden. Because it's secured, it's got that secret no foreign stamp on it that says I'm not allowed to disclose it to anybody. So I read the stuff that says, this is ridiculous. This is shallow and vapid and doesn't say anything about the guilt of my client. all these pages that I've gone through, and I've learned all these alphabet soup names of agencies that have done this work and that work, and all, you know, what the CIA has alleged is going on in the field. Not once is my client's name on that document. What do they think he did exactly? And I can't tell you about those documents because I'm constrained by a protective order that says you lawyers can't talk. So from our perspective, there's this regime that clamps our mouths and puts headphones on our ears. And all those months and weeks that I've spent in Guantanamo where my client is chained to the floor and I'm sitting across from him at a table like this and he can't move, and he's sitting there and telling me about the inhuman indignities that he has suffered, and I'm the only contact he has with anybody who doesn't wear a uniform. Excuse me. I have to be a party to that. I'm chained with him in Guantanamo. What we do is we sit there for 4 hours in the morning and then we take a break. They have prayer, we bring them some lunch. We go again in the afternoon and we do the same thing. And me, their shining hero on a white horse, watches them sit year after year and suffer indignity after indignity. I think I probably used up my time. I didn't get a chance to talk about these horrific indignities that have been suffered since the fall, when this Colonel Bogdan, this new bad guy in my view, who took over as the authority of the detention camps, imposed new draconian, unnecessary, and shameful new policies on these men, and guards were brought in to make them suffer new indignities. Resulted in a February 6th hunger strike that has more or less abated, according to my colleagues on our little listserv where we cry on each other's shoulders and share information. I think that there's still 19 hunger strikers as of last week that we know of, whose lawyers have actually talked to them. There's 19 that we've identified as continuing to hunger strike as their only means of protest. I want to disabuse you of what you might have read. It is true that there's four that I know of who really want to die. If the only way to get out of Guantanamo is in a box, I'll take it. But for most of them, it's their only means of protest. We celebrate our First Amendment and our right to free assembly and our right to express our grievances against our government, and at the same time, in the name of that same amendment, in the name of that same document, we won't even let men decide over their own bodies whether they stop eating military food in protest of having their Qurans desecrated and having their dignity stripped from them. Shame on us. Shame on us. So now that I've left you with big, broad smiles on your faces, I'll be available to talk to anybody who wants to talk.
Actually, I'd like
Thank you.
all the speakers to come up and sit. I don't think we need to use the microphone anymore. So if you all want to, like the three of you, just sit here, and we can take some questions.
I'm going to take some water.
I was just thinking out. So, if you have questions or comments for any one of the three, please start. We've got time for that.
I'm going to have to say something. All this time, it's been referred to as Guantanamo, referring to the prison camps. It's more than that. Guantanamo Bay is home to dependents there still. They are up to date. They have a turbine. They have Wi-Fi. They have satellites. It is a home to civilians and dependents and military men living there. They have a high school. Guantanamo is not just about the prison camp. And this is what I'm trying to get across to everyone. We have a site on Facebook, Gitmo reunion. And I am still in touch with more than 400 of the people that have lived there, my friends. And they have asked me to pass that on. That naval base is not just known for the prison camp. It is known for everyone that has lived there and has built it up and has made history there, has lived through the history there, and has fallen in love with life there. And we just want it out there that it's just not about the prison camps. Yes, the prison camps is the word, an aberration. Maybe it should be moved. Where are you going to put the terrorists? Where are you going to put the prisoners who are actually proven as terrorists? Where are you going to put them? But, you know, there's more to Guantanamo Bay Naval Base than the prison camps. There's history, there's life, there's just culture, there's so much more. So just remember that too, please.
And I celebrate your perspective. I didn't mean to start you.
I haven't had a man touch my knee in like 8 years. Do it again.
Maybe you won't say that.
You're next.
That's a tough act to follow. Right?
Then I'll be yours.
Okay. What I was going to say, we're friends. We just met, but we're friends.
Yeah, I don't have
But
anything else to say.
Good, thank you. But we all see the world, we're all products of our own experience. And your experience, I'm really glad you shared it with me, because that's not the Guantanamo that I know. But I remember somebody was talking about how wonderful Linz, Austria was when they were raised there before World War II. Well, my great-grandfather was killed in a gas chamber there for the crime of being Jewish at Linz, Austria. So the two of us were talking about the same city. Both of us were speaking the truth. I know a little bit about Guantanamo because I've researched a little bit about Guantanamo, and this is what I know. I became a really close, I want to say friend. Every time I visited, I saw William Bennett. We had to stay on the leeward side at the combined.
Leeward Point.
And do you know William Bennett? No, you probably don't, but he was there for 38 years, 41 years, something like that. And he was a Jamaican who, to support his family, came and worked on the military base. And he was like most of the people who work on the military base. They're from Indonesia, and they're Filipinos, and they have been for a very long time. And they worked. And William Bennett and I became close, and we would talk when I'd get back from the prison camp. And at night there was nothing to do, and I would sit and I would talk to this old gardener whose body was ripped from the work that he did every day, and work in the hot Cuban sun, making the gardens look nice around the combined bachelor's quarters, which housed female attorneys and me and others. And the reason I tell you that is because I became curious when he told me that he had finally gotten a raise. Most of the people that he worked with got $1.79 an hour for their work on the military base. He was nodding. And he'd gotten up to like $3.14 an hour. I'm making that up, $3.40 an hour. I don't remember what it was. So I came back to the United States and I did I'm a lawyer, about the Federal Wage and Labor Act, and basically on U.S. bases, the United States government has to pay federal minimum wage. What is that now? 8, whatever it is an hour. You don't know? Whatever it is. $7.50 an hour. Okay, and what I found out is in Guantanamo, the contractors get paid the $7.50 an hour. The ones who bring in the guys who are getting paid $1.70 an hour, and the contractor for bringing this person in from Jamaica to Cuba is getting the other $7 an hour. You're right that people live there and have fond memories and have a life there, but there are a lot of people who live there under a network, a web of exploitation that is in our tax dollars at work paying federal minimum wage to contractors. One of them, I think they're called Burns and Lowe. Is that what it's called?
Burns and Rowe.
Burns and Rowe hasn't bid. They have this, they build the places where people live, where these indentured servants live, and the buses, and so much of the guts of Guantanamo that makes the military able to do what it does there. And they haven't done an open bidding for 3 decades, I was told. I don't know if it's true, I haven't researched it. You probably know about that.
I don't know about that, but I'm wondering if some of those Jamaicans can be like clients of yours to sue these contractors for labor wages.
Yeah,
Many of the
next decade.
Many of the Jamaicans I met down there were friends of mine, and the Filipinos. We were actually, the troops are actually warned in their orientation briefings to don't associate with these people from the third world because they come from poor countries, and they'll do anything to get some information about the operation that they can sell to China or someone because they're so desperate. So don't associate with them. So that's how they're characterized down there. But you know, like Mr. Bennett, they're very good people. Honest
Understand.
people, hard
Question
working.
over there.
But
Okay.
yeah, they get paid less than $3 an hour.
You have to understand though, he's talking now, I'm talking 1957 to
Right.
1964.
Right.
Completely different time frame generation.
Just stand up.
Hi. So I'm gonna field a question, I guess, for anyone that wants to answer. There was, so like throughout the presentation, there's a lot of discussion on the interrogation of the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, or especially Camp Delta. Yet, throughout the presentation, there was also a lot of like hints as to the fact that, you know, much of this interrogation and even the times when they were interrogated was in fact torture. And you had also stated that, you know, torture is not considered, or information gleaned through torture is not considered to be reasonable evidence of criminality. So my question for you guys is there a difference between interrogation and torture in your mind at Guantanamo Bay? Do they switch back and forth, or are they, you know, the same thing? And if that's the case, if the purpose for holding these people at Guantanamo Bay is for building a mosaic of information and, you know, essentially producing information from these people, if it is gained from torture, what rationale could there be for holding them there?
Oh.
Go ahead.
I'll say there is a difference between torture and interrogation. I would recommend this book called How to Bring Down a Terrorist with Brains, Not Brute, or something like that, where the former interrogator was involved in gaining the information that was able to track down this guy Zarqawi in Iraq through relationship building with the people that he interrogated, not brute force and punishment and torture. This is a question that refers directly back to the recent movie Zero Dark 30, in which portrays the use of torture which led to the information to the capture of bin Laden. Which, interestingly enough, the U.S. government, senators said, no information ever gleaned from advanced interrogation or enhanced interrogation techniques ever led to the capture of bin Laden. No information from torture ever was gleaned that led to the finding of bin Laden. We should recognize that torture is a crime. That people who are engaged in torture or order it should be prosecuted under war crimes or under statutes. This whole idea of waterboarding that has come up. I don't believe people at Guantanamo were waterboarded. However, we do know that people held in the CIA black sites were waterboarded. In the history of our country, our nation has prosecuted and executed people who have waterboarded people. But yet today, waterboarding under what was the Bush administration was gleaned acceptable. So there's definitely conflict. Sitting Senator John McCain would know firsthand when he was tortured in Vietnam. And you should know that when John McCain was tortured, he gave up information, false information, he you know, under that duress. So, as we heard in the case that was in the brief or the decision ruled by the judge, who said information from torture is unreliable. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
So, I mean, I would really want to respond to the 0 Dark 30 comment very quickly, if I may. And then, you know, quickly about the waterboarding thing. You know, the difference was that there's a lot of information that points to that, data was gathered from Osama bin Laden's indirect family, like cousins. And they were also, you know, targets of enhanced interrogation, and they did provide information, as well as the fact that the United States has an immense surveillance network, as we've, you know, been keyed into now all over the world. And to put it just as torture is what found Osama bin Laden is not in fact something that you could say with certainty. And even if we can say with certainty that because his family were tortured, we were able to find him, the fact of the matter is that that's his family, and we knew they knew anyways. And in response to the waterboarding, the point, you know, yeah, I think you made a really good point, because something that was considered enhanced interrogation can now be considered torture. And what we see there throughout that is that regardless of how much physical damage it does to a body, it's the position of putting someone under psychological duress, where they have to make a decision for their own self-benefit. So whether, you know, you're putting someone in an Iron Maiden, medieval style, or, you know, you're like giving them sensory deprivation, making them feel like anything could happen to them at any moment, it's not reliable, and it hurts people, especially those that were gathered in the way that you mentioned. So the line between interrogation and torture, I think, really can be, you know, very gray, and you raised really good points there, and I appreciate it. I just think those, you know, an important thing to discuss, like when we're talking about is torture a good way to get information from people. We can't really just limit it to, you know, the horrors of Abu Ghraib and Bagram, because they're more visible and shit-stained.
I appreciate your question, and I just like to speak as a lawyer because I am one. So, and I just a couple of facts. You may recall, you're a little young, but a lot of people who are not quite so young will recall that under the Bush administration, two high-ranking members of the Bush administration gave a new definition of torture in order to say what we're engaging in is not torture. Words are used all the time in law. Law is all about words and expression of complex concepts through the use of language. But the definition of torture that came out of it was if it doesn't cause permanent bodily injury or death, it isn't torture. Now, that was like the enemy combatant designation. That reworked two bodies of jurisprudence. One is U.S. law. In the leading case in U.S. law is Mississippi versus Green and all of the children of that case. Mississippi versus Green was a black guy who was thought to have murdered somebody. The sheriff, they hung him twice. They hung him once till he was near death, and then they hung him again to get a confession out of him. And the second time, as he's losing, they let him off. They were literally hanging him for minutes at a time, according to the witnesses. He said, okay, I did it, because they kept saying, admit you did it, admit you did it. And so the United States said torture is not permitted in U.S. law enforcement, period. That's the law. Supreme Court, ironclad, it's been ratified 1,000 times by 1,000 cases since then. In the international level, we have two conventions against torture. And the United States actually drafted the language and asked the 176 countries in one, and I think 111 or something countries in the other, to be signatories to that. Under our Constitution, if it's self-executing, that is, there's two ways we can join agreements with other countries. We could just join an agreement, which is like a contract between the president and another country, and that could be just broken. But if Congress actually ratifies a treaty, it's exactly the same as if Congress passes a law in the United, and then the president signs it. It's then U.S. law. The Torture Convention was never actually ratified by Congress. We proposed it, other countries adopted it, we said we agree with it, we signed it, but we never did ratify it, so that the United States contended during this period of time that Captain Yee has talked to, and that you're speaking so eloquently to, that, hey, we're not bound by that, even when it was admitted, because Congress wasn't a self-executing treaty. I think that as a lawyer, they talk about us and loopholes. You have to ask yourself a question as an American. I became a lawyer because I believe in the rule of law. I believe that Professor Page has a reasonable view of the world, and I have a reasonable view of the world, and maybe we're not going to see it the same way, and we're going to have disputes. So what we're going to do is engage in a collective process where we delegate the rulemaking authority to people that we think we could trust. They're going to make law, and then we're going to just, in a handshake, agree that we're going to abide by those laws. And unless it becomes so oppressive and tyrannical that it warrants getting together in Philadelphia and doing a Declaration of Independence, we're through with that tyrant, we're going to start anew. We're going to follow the laws that we're bound by. And if anybody's going to follow it, it's that branch, which is the second branch, which is called the executive branch. They're supposed to execute the laws that are made by the first branch. And they're supposed to implement the laws that they're... And when they just say this to the law at a time of fear like post 9/11, then I think you as Americans have to ask yourself how much you're invested in the rule of law. How much do you believe in this system? And if you don't, that's a fair decision that you're going to make, but don't pretend to. Because that's just too hypocritical to say you're doing it in the name of freedom and you're doing it in the name of due process. Stop it. We should just stop it and say we don't really believe in the system we say that we believe in. That's what I think, what that's worth.
Make another comment on the torture aspect. And this is interesting because this came from my alma mater, West Point. A couple of years ago, West Point officially wrote a letter to Fox, warning Fox that their show 24 with Jack, what's his name? Jack Bauer. Jack Bauer, who tortures people in order to get him, warned Fox that your show is a favorite amongst our cadets at West Point, and it's tainting their perspective of real work that they have to go do once they become officers and go into the military. Real interesting.
Good.
During the, when news was coming out about Abu Ghraib, I remember that at one point there was a commander who was brought from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib, and apparently his charge from his superiors was to gitmoize Abu Ghraib.
His name is Miller?
General Jeffrey Miller.
And so my question is, kind of, big picture, what does that mean? Because it's now a concept, and there's people who are working very hard to try and deconstruct that concept, but the concept has been created. So if you were going to say, what's that mean, and sketch and outline it out, what is that concept?
Who are you addressing this question to?
I'm guessing it'd be the two of you that thought about the...
What's the exact question?
Well, the concept of to take another prison and to gitmoize it. That was his charge. What does that mean? What did he do?
Yeah.
What was it that his superiors were saying? Okay, we want you to do this and this.
Right.
And I know it's a concept, so there's not necessarily specific things, but big picture, what does that mean exactly?
I see Nancy, who's the executive director of No More Guantanamo, and I see Packy, who's an activist who's been fighting Guantanamo for a long time. And I apologize to them because they've heard this response from me before, because I say it all the time. When I hear about the president's let's close Guantanamo, and so many good people are saying close Guantanamo, I always say it's just geography. if you take these men and you put them in a maximum security prison in Thompson, Illinois, that's just geography, and if they suffer the same treatment. The Physicians for Human Rights have written a beautiful booklet, multi-page booklet that explains why and how solitary confinement over time is itself torture. And that where it happens isn't important, it's that it happens. The Gitmo model, which shifted from, I wasn't around during the Camp X-ray days, when people were kept in kennels, as you saw depicted accurately. And then the early days of Camp Delta, now the whole thing is like Camp Delta. But I have been around from the Camp Echo days in 2005, and I saw them build Camp 5 and saw them build Camp 6. And Camps 5 and 6, the physical torture, which makes us all gasp, and this young man was speaking so eloquently too, that sort of stopped in my experience, and at least anecdotally from my clients. I'm going to say towards the end of the Bush administration. By 2008, it was yesterday's news, not for my clients, but it wasn't happening. But the torturous environment, the psychological torture that you were describing, the life without hope, which is no life at all, if you don't think there's any way you're getting out of there. Indefinite detention is torturous. And Guantanamo adopted this model in Camps 5 and 6 of the supermaxes of originally Colorado and Wisconsin and Illinois, where people are held in solitary, and they have a little iron door that gets open, steel door that gets open once in a while, and food gets slipped in, and they have a toilet here, and on the top of that is their sink, and they're in an 86 square foot, required by federal law, 86 square foot little environment. That's what Gitmo adopted. And so I think someone thought it forward-looking to adopt the model of the state's supermax to confine people, and also routinize it and protocol it such that the, what's her name, London, the woman in Abu Ghraib, achieved notoriety and was prosecuted. What's her name?
Lindsay England.
England. London.
Lindsay England.
London, England. I'm sorry, I'm getting old. That some of the discretion would be taken away from her, so that they would have to keep logs of what they fed this person and what medication and who requested medication, and that was thought of as a sort of contemporary imposition of a protocol that's humane and consistent with correctional philosophies in the United States. Again, I think we have to ask ourselves how humane that is, but it wasn't as horrifically abusive in such a dramatic way as what you'll see on 24 or what we saw in Upper Right.
Take one more.
Well, I was thinking that we might phase out right now because it's 6 o'clock. And,
Can I just make one more real quick comment?
go ahead.
You mentioned Major General Jeffrey Miller. He's the one who actually prosecuted me under the military. He was the commander in Guantanamo when I was there. And the Gitmoizing aspect of Abu Ghraib, while I was at Guantanamo, he was sent in a secret mission to Abu Ghraib. And basically what General Miller did was he took two operations, detention and intelligence gathering, which have equal importance, and he put the intelligence gathering over the detention, making the detention subservient to the interrogators and intelligence. And that was the concept he brought to Abu Ghraib, which basically gave the authority all to the intelligence gathering to dictate to the guards, torture this guy, torture that guy, and whatnot. And from a military perspective, I thought that was just a strategic military blunder, and that's what led to the enormous amounts of abuse in combination with other stuff. But yeah, General Miller is the one who took responsibility for putting me in jail, prosecuting me, bringing charges against me, and ultimately he would be recommended for a reprimand by the U.S. Army, the Department of the U.S. Army, but the Department of Defense ultimately waived it and said, well, let him retire, give him a couple of words, and he went on his way, no third star.
So no one's been held accountable for Guantanamo.
Well, I'd like to thank you for the presentations and credit the Department of Justice.